While there are hundreds of units in Warhammer 3, and that's just counting the Warriors of Chaos, there are still some areas of factions that are missing a little something. Whether it's some sort of defense versus large for the vampire counts, or a giant squig for the greenskins, certain things just aren't meant to be in game. Until now. The expanded rosters mod adds a bunch of new units to various factions in the game, all accurate to the lore and tabletop, so let's take a look at how they fit into their respective factions and if they're any good. Plus stick around to hear how you can save $30 on a new C7 ergonomic chair from today's sponsor, Flexispot. So this mod is actually a collection of mods for the different factions it covers, so if you just want to use the Beastmen units, but don't want to have to deal with the Chaos Dwarves getting a bunch more units than they already have, you can pick and choose which ones to use and enable at any time. With that in mind, I'm going to go through each faction, the units they add, how to use them in combat, and how these units fit into the current roster. So let's start with the Beastmen. First up, we have the Great Weapons Gore Herd. This drops a very small amount of attack and defense, but it doubles their armor piercing damage from the base unit. This obviously makes them more of a damage focused front lines instead of a defense. You can use them similarly to the basic Gore Herd, as the difference in melee stats won't make much real difference on how they perform. Only now they'll do a lot better versus more armored targets. They still don't have tons of defense or armor themselves, so you'll have to keep an eye on them to make sure they're not taking too much damage, and try to focus units with less damage output, but lots of armor to get some easy value. Bestigor Herd have now been renamed to the Great Weapons Bestigor Herd, and this new Bestigor Herd come with small improvements to their melee stats and a bonus versus infantry, but are sacrificing over 2/3 of their armor piercing damage. This makes them a lot better versus hordes of less armored infantry, but a lot worse versus armor. Obviously try to use them to clear out all chaff and pull in other units with armor piercing to take on your key threats. They're a bit of a strange unit since at their stage of the game most units will have armor, but they're an option for those odd occasions that they don't. And lastly, Gouge Horns. Compared to the previous unit, these see huge improvements across the board at the cost of having a very small unit count. They compare quite well to Chaos Spawn with much improved melee stats, but reduced damage. There's still no armor piercing though, so again you'll need to focus on less armored targets to ensure they can punch through. Aside from the damage, they're reasonably tanky with great defense and armor, but I'd worry about their small entity sizes before totally relying on them as line holders. With so few of them, they're very easy to surround and burst down. Moving over to the Chaos Dwarf, first up we have the Bull Centaur Lords. These are pretty much beefed up versions of the heroes with more armor, attack, damage and charge bonus, and a little less defense. You can use them pretty much the same to work on the flanks with your other Centaur units, and make use of their anti-infantry bonus to chew through even the toughest of ranged infantry. Charging the rears of the front lines is also a great use of his time, or even targeting enemy footlords in duels. Just keep him safe with some allies, otherwise that low defense can come back to bite him. The Hobgoblin Great Khan is similar to the Night Goblin Warboss from the Greenskins, but without poison and with ranged. It also sees a lot of stat buffs, making them much tougher and well-rounded battlers, mainly due to the built-in mount. With that high speed, they make for great flanking skirmishers, and their range damage is fairly high, though non-armor piercing, so picking the right targets will be key to their success. Their melee stats are also pretty great, but again, no real armor piercing, so choose targets carefully to ensure you can take them down. Good options are less armored lords and heroes, or ranged infantry, alongside some other cav. And lastly, we have the Hobgoblin Pelt Shaman. This is similar to the Goblin Great Shaman with a new built-in wolf. Still have some stat improvements, making them slightly stronger across the board, but will still function more or less the same. Use their high speed to get casts off wherever needed, and now enjoy using the lore of the Little War as the Chaos Dwarves. We also have one hero unit, the Hobgoblin Khan. These are pretty much worse versions of the Great Khans, which makes a lot of sense. No ranged option and slightly worse stats across the board, but you can use them the exact same for the melee. They don't come with the mount right out the gate, so front lines work until they get some levels under their belt will be a good idea. That said, they can eventually get the Giant Wolf mount. This gives them a lot more speed and charge bonus and makes them a lot better for getting into the backlines ranged infantry or less armored lords and heroes. Like I said before, use them the same as the Great Khans, aside from having no ranged option. Moving on to the actual units, first up we have Ogre Labourers. These are pretty much slightly worse Ogre Bulls, which is what you'd expect. They still have decent speed in their Ogre Charge, which is strong when combined with their respectable damage. Melee stats are pretty low, so cycle charging will be the way to go to keep them healthy, but in a pinch against less threatening units, embedding them into the front lines would do pretty well, and let them rack up some damage from relative safety. Zealot Berserkers are pretty much Chaos Dwarf Slayers, and the stats reflect this too. Compared to regular Slayers, they're the exact same, but with a little less defense, a little more attack, and a bonus versus infantry instead of large. Plus, they have the Berserk passive, which increases their physical resistance and melee attack the longer they're in melee, so if you can somehow keep them alive, they should do pretty well. I'd say these are best used as support infantry going onto the flanks or front lines of infantry if you're against chaff. Their low defense and lack of armor will make them melt against anything with any damage, so picking your targets will be key to them surviving to see the end of battle. Their damage is pretty great against low armor, you just need to find them something to battle that they can deal it to without dying. That said, at least they'll fight to the death. Next up we have the Acolytes of Hashut. These are a really bizarre unit. Compared to the Infernal Ironsworn, aka the endgame Chaos Dwarf front line, they have an improved defense and weapon strength alongside a bonus versus large, and lose a small amount of HP, attack and charge bonus. but there's only 16 of them in the unit, meaning these are some of the densest units to ever hit the scene. They're not even large or anything, they're just the same size as normal Chaos Dwarves. My best suggestion for these guys is as a large target hunter on your front lines. The small unit size makes them a challenge to use as line holders, even with their high defense, so focusing on key targets to bring the heat will be a better use of their time and keep the rest of your army a lot safer. That said, if you're feeling risky, their defense is exceptionally high, so as long as enemies don't walk through or around them, they will keep themselves alive for a shockingly long time and do some great damage whilst doing it. Gnoblar Labourers are the worst version of Gnoblar Trappers from the Ogres, and the stats reflect this, with decreases across the board, honestly making them a little bit too bad. With leadership so low, they'll run from basically anything, even with their halfway decent 20 defense. The range damage is pretty pitiful too, and with such a short range, quite a risk to get off safely. That said, they're an obscenely cheap unit, so it only makes sense that they'd come with a matching stats card. Chaos Dwarf Quarrelers are very similar to regular Dwarf Quarrelers, with the exact same range stats but more HP, armor and weapon strength, and a little bit less leadership. They can still be used exactly the same to fire from the back lines and rain down decent non-armor piercing damage onto whatever you put in front of them. Nice big firing arc for no risk of friendly fire, decent melee defense just in case they get flanked, a basic but solid unit. Next up, Naphthabomb Infernal Guard. These drop some melee stats and unit size compared to the regular Infernal Guard, but come with some flaming short range explosive missiles, making them a lot better as a support unit rather than outright ranged infantry. I'd use them to rain fire on enemies as they close into charge to try and break them before they even reach your lines. You could use them as your front lines, as the damage output before lines clash would be pretty crazy. The only downside of this would be they may not be able to use all their ammo before getting stuck in melee, but it is a good trade-off to have this much damage to lob before they have to get their hands dirty. Next we have Annihilators, and I'm now realizing quite how many units there are, so I'm going to try my best to keep these descriptions a little bit brief. Pretty much the Chaos Dwarf version of the Trollhammer Torpedoes. Less range, but even more armor piercing and anti-large damage. You can use them pretty much the same to focus on large targets, and they'll put in great work even if the range does make things a little bit of a risk. Hobhounds Ravagers are much improved over the Wolf Riders with improvements to every stat but speed. They can still be used more or less the same, so cycle charging with moderate charge bonus, or some sustained combat against lesser enemies with respectable melee stats. Whichever you choose, they'll do well with their great speed and decent toughness from the armor and shield. Lava Trolls have more armor than regular trolls, but worse melee stats, damage and charge bonus, but of course they have that fire damage. They can be used the same as all troll units, so embed them in the front lines to deal damage whilst keeping them safe behind your front lines troops. The longer they battle, the tougher they get from their blazing body passives, so try and keep them battling for as long as you can with that lower leadership. The Siege Giant has much more armor than the Greenskins Giant with more defense, less attack and charge bonus. They can still be used the same as all giants, so as a ping cushion for enemy ranged, at least now they'll be slightly tankier to non-armor piercing missiles. If it does get to melee, the damage output will still be great, and it'll now be a little bit tougher than normal, but I'd still keep it supported with allied units. And lastly, the Hobgoblin Bolt Thrower. This is less range than the Dwarven Bolt Thrower, but a little more missile strength. It's a basic early artillery unit best used against large targets to make the most of that bonus and the single target missiles. Keep it well back and out of melee, and it should do alright. Okay, that was a lot of units, and we've still got a lot to go, so let me take a quick break to thank Flexispot for sponsoring the video and sending over their C7 mesh chair. Look folks, I do a lot of sitting down. You could call me a professional. This desk right here, I sit and either work or relax for, no joke, close to 12 hours a day, every single day of every single week of the entire year. Yes, I probably should go outside, but that is besides the point. Now, thanks to Flexispot, I can already stand every now and then thanks to my adjustable desk, but still, that is a lot of time to spend in exactly one position, so I need to make sure I'm as comfortable and supported as humanly possible. Well, they sent over this here C7 mesh chair, and now I may never stand again, because this thing is just that comfortable. This bad boy right here can fit so many different seating positions in it. You can use the gamer cockpit, the meditative monk, or even the reclined relaxation. However you like to sit, it's built to not only keep you as comfortable as possible, but also as supported as possible, so that every time you stand up, you don't feel all your bones click back into place like you've been raised from the dead by Manfred. God, he's bald. It's got self-adaptive back supports, an adjustable headrest, and a breathable mesh construction, and now that it's summertime, that's especially great for preventing too much heat buildup, if you know what I'm saying. It's got 3 direction adjustable armrests, and obviously, it has between 90 and 128 degrees of recline, all whilst keeping your spine fully supported. And oh so comfy. Not gonna lie, it's a little bit dangerous giving me this here chair because with this headrest, I may nap, and that could cut into my procrastination time. All of these features are all also built to last with rigorous product testing and up to 10 years of warranty on certain components. If all of this sounds like something that you'd personally like to sit in, then use the link in the description to get $30 off your own C7 chair. A huge thanks to Flexispot for not only supporting my spine, but also the channel, and now back to the units. Next up, we have the Dark Elves. First, the Tower Masters. These are another low entity count melee infantry unit. Compared to Blackguard, they have more melee stats, weapon strength and charge bonus, but no bonus damage versus anything. Similar to the other units from this mod, their small entity count makes them risky to use as line holders even with their insanely high melee stats, so support infantry is their best bet with that high damage. If you do want to use them as a front lines, give them lots of support and be on the lookout for breaches at all times, as it only takes one of them to falter before it all falls apart. Next, we have the Hunters of Anath Raymer. These are a bit of a weird sort of hybrid weapons unit with passable melee stats and even some armor piercing, bonus versus large, and armor sundering damage. Their ranged is low ammo but has a decent medium range and moderate non-armor piercing damage. I'd say use their high speed to get them into position and focus down key less armored targets before having them flank with any tanky front lines and bring them down a peg with their armor sundering. Next up, the Lords of Oblivion. This time it's a low entity count cav unit. Compared to Cold One Riders, they lose armor and a tiny bit of defense, but everything else goes way up. Their damage is crazy, and with the charge bonus and melee stats, they can cycle charge or fight in sustained combat extremely well. Add on their flight and excellent speed, and they can be anywhere to fight anything at any time. And lastly, the Magma Dragon. This has a little bit less HP, armor and weapon strength than the Black Dragon, but some more leadership and defense alongside the extremely powerful Magma Dragon's breath ability. Use it the same as any dragon, flying around breathing fire onto clumps of armored foes before diving into some melee versus pretty much anything with stats like that. Just look out for ranged focus and it getting surrounded, and it should do great. Next up, the Dwarves. First, we have the Prospectors. These are a direct upgrade to Blasting Charge Miners with improvements to nearly every stat but armor, leadership, and speed. Their melee stats still aren't the best, but they see a huge improvement to their armor piercing damage, making them a risky but powerful frontlines damage healer. Their ranged damage has double the ammo and now deals a good chunk of armor piercing damage, making it very effective at softening up even the toughest of front lines before the clash. I'd keep them back and use all their ammo before going into melee and supporting your front lines rather than outright replacing them. The Old Guard are another low entity count melee infantry unit. Stats wise, they're a huge improvement over Great Weapons Longbeards in everything but speed, making them a very deadly damage dealer, as well as incredibly tanky, especially with their Enrage ability, granting them 40% damage resistance for 22 seconds. I'd still avoid using them as your entire front lines as usual, and instead integrate them to add some extra damage and meatiness. Obviously, very similar to regular hammers with improved melee stats and much less armor piercing damage in favour of a bonus versus infantry. If you want an alternate front line that's a little bit tankier and better versus less armored targets, then they're a great choice while still maintaining almost everything that makes hammers great. Drakefire Pistol Iron Drakes work as a good midpoint between the Flamethrowers and the Troll Hammers. Less missile strength than Troll Hammers, but deal flaming and flammable imbued armor piercing damage from a medium range. Still a little bit of explosive power, so targeting clusters of infantry will be a good shout to maximize their area damage. That said, focus firing large targets will still do well, you just be leaving a tiny bit of potential on the table. Bugman's Thrower is pretty much a catapult with more damage, flaming and flammable attacks, and the liquid fortification ability. It can be used the exact same as a regular catapult, only now you can enjoy dealing just a little bit more damage per volley. And lastly, the Grudge Crusher Dreadnought. This is more or less the dwarven version of the Steam Tank, apart from it's 10 times as adorable. Just look at that little dude. The focus here is really on the missile damage with that staggeringly large missile strength, best used against large targets to increase the chances of shots landing and making the most of that damage. Melee isn't too bad with great armor piercing anti-infantry damage, but the melee stats and charge bonus are a little bit weak, so I'd definitely focus on using up all that ammo before sending it into the front lines. It's super tanky, but I'd still keep an eye on it, as the armor piercing ranged focus, particularly to the rear, could spell a quick doom just as easily as being surrounded in melee. Next we have the Empire, and they gain one new Lord unit, the Battle Wizard Lord of Fire. Pretty much a stronger version of the Bright Wizard hero with better stats across the board, aside from damage. Still wants to focus on spellcasting since the low armor will spell a quick doom against anything with a moderate amount of damage. As for mount, it comes with a Warhorse, which grants it more speed and charge bonus, but just use it to get cast off wherever needed, a Barded Warhorse, which now gains a bit more armor, which is nice, but doesn't change how to use them, and the Imperial Pegasus, which grants it maximum speed and flight to get cast off wherever needed. It can also do some very light fighting versus low armor backlines, but only if it's super safe and no spells need casting. Moving over to the units, first up we have the Shielded Halberdiers. Halberdiers, but with shields and a little more defense. This makes them into the best line holders the Empire have, whilst keeping that armor piercing and anti-large damage. Use them just the same, only now enjoy them being far tankier to all forms of damage. Why these not in game? The Prophets of Doom are a direct upgrade to Flagellants, with huge stat increases to melee attack and defense, weapon strength, and even a little charge bonus, at the cost of being much less entities. Their Insensible to Pain also makes them extremely tanky, though will only come really useful if they're losing, so is a little bit unreliable. They can be used just the same as Flagellants, so as an unbreakable line holder with decent non-armor piercing damage. They'll still die fast with 0 armor, but with defense like that, they'll last a lot longer than Flagellants, even with the tiny unit size. The repeater rifle, Nuln Ironsides, are a totally unique unit that has never been in the game before and got removed because mom and dad had a fight. They drop some range and ammo over regular Ironsides and gain a ton more missile strength. Their damage per missile is actually lower, but they fire more shots per volley and reload a little faster, adding up to a lot more damage per second. They can be used the same as before, only from a slightly shorter range for much more burst damage. Road Wardens are pretty much pistoliers with no range stats and some improvements in the melee department. Essentially a very early super cheap kinda shitty melee cav option for the early game. I'd keep them cycle charging and only stay to fight very weak backlines with their pitiful melee stats. Next up we have Knights of the Black Lynx. These are the more charge focused version of the Knights of the Black Rose. They have less melee stats but much more charge, making them a lot better at cycle charging and a lot worse at sustained combat. Use them just for this and you should have no problems no matter what you're charging with, their improved armor piercing anti-large damage. Next, we have the Greenskins, and these actually have two separate mods for Goblins and Orc units, so you can pick and choose which set you'd like, or of course, just take both. First up, the Goblins. They come with the new Forest Goblin Warboss Lord. These are a slight sidestep from the Night Goblin Warboss with a little more armor and attack, but a little less speed and defense. They can still be used mostly the same to fight less armored targets and spread that poisoning damage to anything that comes close. They even keep the Loon's ability, so can throw out some nice area damage every now and then. As for their mounting options, they can choose the Giant Spider. This gains them a lot more speed and charge bonus, making them better at charging around into enemy rears alongside other Spider Riders. They still keep the same damage and melee stats, so can do some sustained combat, just don't let them get pinned down with the extra size. Alternatively, you can go for the Catchweb Arachnarok Spider. This makes them into Arachnarok Spiders with surprisingly slightly worse stats for HP and leadership. Still massive monsters as long as they can avoid being focused by ranged. Moving over to the units, first up we have Snotlings. These are the bottom of the barrel frontlines meat shields. Worse stats than Goblins in everything, no damage, no survivability, just use them to get in the way and eat damage before it can reach your actual units, and they've done their job. Forest Goblins lose some slight stats compared to Night Goblins but gain leadership and a little bit of armor, making them a slightly cheaper alternative if a little less reliable. They still have poison damage, so focus on spreading that to as many units as you can and bring in something else to do all the real damage for them. We also have Spear Forest Goblins. These lose a little attack and charge bonus to gain more defense. They can be used the exact same, only now they're a little bit tankier, which is a win for me and would make them the obvious choice in pretty much every scenario. We also have Spear Night Goblins. Similar to Forest Goblins, they lose attack and charge to gain some defense. Just the same, but now tankier, so an easy win. Hill Goblins are a stronger mid-game Goblins front lines unit. Compared to Spear Night Goblins, aside from speed, they see improvements to every stat, especially defense, making them very tanky as far as Goblins are concerned. Their melee stats are still a little bit mid, and the damage isn't anything to get too excited about, but they'll do a decent job as a Goblin line holder. We also have Bow Forest Goblins. These are a little worse in melee than Night Goblin Archers, but have a tiny bit more missile strength, so if you can keep them safe, they're a great pick. They still have poison missiles, so focus on spreading that to everything you can, rather than worrying about damage output, since it'll never be that high anyway. Goblin Triple Wolf Chariots drop a little bit of attack from Wolf Riders, but gain a nice chunk of charge bonus and weapon strength, making them into a very strong early game chariot unit. With that extremely high speed, they'll be very hard to pin down, and as long as you keep them moving, they should do a great job and be fairly hard to take out. Just don't let them sit in melee, or those weaker stats will come back to bite them. Next we have the Colossal Squig. It's a big squig that has better stats than a herd of smaller ones. It has the same armor, but then everything else sees a major increase. With melee stats and damage and charge bonus like that combined with its speed, it can go anywhere and do anything. Cycle charging or sustained combat on the front lines are both viable, just don't let it get too focused, as at the end of the day, it's still a giant meatball. We also have the Armored Colossal Squig. This drops a little bit of speed to gain a healthy chunk of armor, some defense, and charge bonus. Use it just the same, only now it's a tiny bit slower, but a whole lot harder to kill. Goblin Spear Chuckers are a Goblin version of the Bolt Thrower with worse melee stats, a little less range, but a tiny bit more missile strength. Keep it at the back and firing on large targets to make the most of that bonus damage, and keep it out of melee at all costs or it will die in seconds. And lastly, Snot Room Riders. These are a regiment of renown of sorts, but as far as I can tell, they aren't a version of any existing unit. They appear to be Snotlings riding giant turds like Space Hoppers, and that increases almost all of their stats. They're still not great, but with speed like that, they can at least try to attack some backlines enemies, just make sure they're exceptionally weak. That said, for some reason their mass behaves incredibly strangely in battle, so have fun. Next up, we have the Orcs. First up, the Savage Orc Warboss. These have no armor and less defense than the regular Orc Warboss, but gain some attack, damage, and charge bonus. Pretty much what you'd expect, an Orc Warboss, but it's a Savage Orc. Keep it fighting anything with low damage to keep it alive, and pray it doesn't come across anything with magical damage. For mounts, it can choose a Warboar, which gains it a little bit of armor, as well as speed, damage, and charge bonus. This makes him much more of a charging lord, making him easier to keep alive. Alternatively, they can go for the Wyvern. This gains them more speed and flight, HP and armor, but loses melee stats and damage. It can now fight anywhere on the map, making him a terror to almost anything as long as he doesn't get surrounded and focused. We're also getting a couple of new heroes. The Orc Big Boss is pretty much a slightly weaker version of the Orc War Boss, but can be used mostly the same as a frontlines tanky powerhouse. And they can choose the Warboar to gain more speed and charge bonus, make them great at charging, so do more of that or stay in the front lines, being careful not to get surrounded. We also have the Savage Orc War Boss, pretty much a slightly weaker version of the Lord. Can be used basically the same, and you'll be fine. You can also pick up the Warboar, same improvements as the Lord 2, so again, use it just the same. Moving over to the units, first up we have these Spear Orc Boys. These drop some attack and damage but gain a nice chunk of defense, charge defense versus large, and a little bit of bonus damage versus large. They can be used the same as a line holder, only now they'll be better at this job and absorb charge a lot easier. We also have Spear Savage Orcs, same as the last unit, drop damage to gain defense and now a shield. Makes them tankier, so use them to hold the line and bring in other units for the real damage. We also have Shielded Orc Biggins, same as before, less damage, more defense, makes them tankier, so is an absolute win. We also have Great Weapons Savage Orc Biggins, which is a mouthful. This drops some of both melee stats to gain a nice chunk of armor piercing damage. This makes them a lot more deadly on the front lines, but also quite a bit squishier. Quite a high risk unit, but can work well in a very aggressive comb to eat through enemy front lines in moments. We have Dual Weapons Black Orcs. These drop armor piercing damage to gain improvements to both melee stats. Not entirely sure why you'd pick them unless you're up against mostly low armored targets, and even then it's questionable, but they're here if you want them. We have Shielded Black Orcs, which are technically now called Black Orcs, and regular Black Orcs now called Great Weapons Black Orcs, but I digress. These drop attack and damage to gain a ton more defense as well as the shields. These are a seriously tanky frontlines unit that would work great in a monster-focused army as they can absorb a serious amount of punishment to keep your beasts much safer. Left alone, they likely won't take down anything fast, but keep them supported and they'll do a great job. And lastly, these Savage Giants. It's exactly what it says it is on the tin. Drops armor to gain resistance and drops defense and weapon strength to gain attack, speed and charge bonus. Very strange unit, but hey, that extra speed makes it slightly more likely they'll make it to the front lines in one piece, so I'm not complaining. Use them pretty much the same to tear the front lines apart, and they'll do about as well given all the changes. Moving over to Norsca, we have the Jarl hero. These are weaker versions of the Chieftain Lords, but with a lot more armor piercing right out the gate. It can be used much the same, but now deal a lot more damage to tougher units, making them great for beefing up front lines or taking part in duels. They also come with 2 mounts. The Norscan Warhorse gains the more speed and charge bonus, so can now be used to charge as well as fight in sustained combat, or the War Mammoth, which drops some speed and melee stats, but gains a ton of HP, weapon strength, and charge bonus. Great frontlines monster or slow-moving cycle charger, just game fighting, and it'll do great work. Our first unit is the Pit Fighters. These are a weaker version of Berserkers with slightly worse stats across the board. They can still perform the same sorts of jobs, they'll just be slightly worse. Get them on the front lines, fighting chaff, and they'll rack up plenty of kills and take quite a lot of damage whilst doing it. We have Shield Maidens, which are a great midpoint between Marauders and Champions, and the stats reflect this very well. Very strong defense, making them a great line holder, whilst you bring in other units to deal all the real damage. Decent speed and some okay damage mean they can put in some moderate work themselves, but as I said, keep them supported for the best results. Huskars are the new top-of-the-line Norscan frontlines infantry. Much more focused on defense, with huge armor, very high defense, and low armor piercing damage. Attack and non-armor piercing damage is okay, but against anything tough, they'll need lots of help. Bondsmen gain more range and ammo than javelins, but a lot less damage and melee stats. A very early basic ranged infantry troop that is likely not to rack up too many kills, but will put out some decent hits over the course of the battle, so long as they don't get flanked. Reavers, however, are a very short-range anti-infantry ranged infantry unit and work very well on the flanks of enemy front lines, especially if they're low armor. They have some decent melee stats of their own, but I'd still focus on using all of their limited ammo before sending them in. The Valkyrie is a midpoint monster between the Manticore and the Frost Dragon. Extremely fast flying speed and respectable melee stats alongside magical, armor piercing, anti-large damage. This all makes it a great monster or cav hunter, but with speed like that, it can fight basically anything. As long as it doesn't get surrounded or focus too hard with armor piercing ranged, it should do just fine. And lastly, the Frost Hydra. This drops some attack from the regular Hydra to gain defense and frostbite attacks. Aside from that, it functions mostly the same as a powerful frontlines monster, only now it comes in blue. And lastly, we have the Vampire Counts. Skeleton Reapers drop some defense from regular Skeleton Warriors, gain attack and a nice chunk of armor piercing. These are a very early armor piercing unit and will do well against those tougher early battles against the Dwarves or anyone else with a tanky start. They may die a little faster, but if you can keep Necromancers nearby and focus on aggression, they can work great. The Spirit Hosts are essentially an earlier Cairn Wraith unit. Same lack of armor and reliance on physical resistance, but worse stats across the board with extremely low attack and defense and only non-armor piercing damage. They are a little weak and a bit niche, but with the high speed and terror, can work well as a flanking infantry support unit to break front lines and allow your army to get to the back lines faster, as long as they're not fighting alone, as they will simply die, especially if magical damage is involved. Blarmy and Handmaidens are a strong mid-game alternative to Graveguard. Lower armor and defense, but much higher attack and speed makes them great at shredding chaff. The total lack of armor piercing does make them a lot weaker versus anything remotely tough, so I'd use them as a support unit to make use of their speed to surround front lines or even get into the back lines ranged infantry for some easy kills. Halberd Graveguard drops some attack to gain defense and some armor piercing anti-large damage. The increased defense and charge defense makes them a great line holder, however the lack of shields does make them more susceptible to ranged, so it all really depends on what you're up against. Still, if you're looking for the best purely melee line holder in the vampire counts, then these are it. Hell Knights have comparable stats to Lancers and Barding Black Knights, but are a little bit more focused on sustained combat and with flight. They can get anywhere on the map and fight anything, especially with their armor piercing. They work great at attacking enemy backlines, but can just as easily charge the rear of the front lines from the sky for some decent impact. And lastly, the Blood Knight Castellans. These swap the charge bonus and defense for some more attack and bonus versus infantry. This makes them into a bit more of a backlines terror for ranged infantry. I would say stick them in sustained combat, but the drop in defense makes it very challenging, so proceed with caution when fighting anything tougher than artillery. With that, I can talk about what I actually think of this mod. This mod, or collection of mods, is incredibly impressive. Not only are all of these units somewhat balanced, they all fit into their factions like they were supposed to be there all along. I think this is in part due to the creator making sure everything is incredibly accurate to the tabletop and very balanced. You know me, I don't really care how accurate or balanced things are as long as they're fun, but here, they're both, which I can very much respect and enjoy. I also respect the choice to have each faction's units as their own individual mods, so you can pick and choose which ones you'd like to use in game at a time, or what you want the AI to be able to use. They're all also as easy as subscribing on the workshop and they're in game, just like that. While I probably won't leave them enabled in every game for content reasons, if I was playing the game purely for fun, then I see no reason why you couldn't just leave them enabled at all times, aside from if they caused any conflicts. I can highly recommend everyone give this one a try, as it really does feel like a bit of unit-based DLC, but instead of being overpriced, it's totally free. And with that, I think I've covered everything I have to say about this great collection of mods. Let me know in the comments of any other mods that you'd like me to have a look at, like, subscribe, and if you want more mod videos, then check out this video on the Victory Conditions Overhaul, another must-have for all players.